Hello, welcome to my channel, Anglican Aesthetics. My hope is that this will be a short video. I wanted to make a video addressing Old Testament violence because this has been an objection I've seen from MindShift, from Joe Schmid, concerning whether Yahweh could be the source of objective morality. I want you to picture two cities. One city is, let's say, like your normal suburb. People are talking, they're laughing together, they're having a good time, and then fire rains down on them, or marauders come and sweep them away. We'd rightly be horrified. That would be a tragedy. Now imagine a city where a guest comes in and they are gang raped by the city, brutally murdered, there are injustices done. And it's riddled with corruption. From the sentence, God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, you don't know whether the city is the first one I described or the second one I described. The imaginative frame you take into reading the text, and reading any text, impacts the way you understand and receive that text. So if you have a sentence, God destroyed the city Sodom and Gomorrah, it doesn't tell you what kind of city that is. But if you have the imaginative frame of everything else that's going on in the narrative, Sodom and Gomorrah is debauched, violent, they rape guests, they rape people who are just seeking hospitality, then you can actually understand that action a little bit better. Why God would judge a city like that. So for instance, suppose you have an entire community gang rape and kill a young girl. My wife knows of stories like this, actually. She was a missionary overseas. She knows of stories like this, where it's not just an individual or a group, it's an entire community. Okay, so it might be hard for, MindShift and Brandon, I think, and Joe are, they're white and they seem to live fairly comfortably, right? It might be hard to imagine that sort of scenario, but it happens all over the world, and it happened in the ancient world. This was a brutal place. So, for instance, there's a YouTuber I listen to that I like to relax to named Oversimplified, who does these amazing history videos. And in his video on the Punic Wars, the first Punic War, he talks about how it was common in the ancient world for enemies to come, cut down people, cut your pets in half, things like this. This was just common in the ancient world. And he's right. It just was common in the ancient world. This was a dark place. So imagine, for instance, a city, a community of Nazis that take a bunch of Jews, beat them in the streets, and then laugh as they're doing it, right? The kids are doing it too. If the adults were tried and found guilty and executed, we wouldn't call that a genocide. And the reason we wouldn't call that a genocide is because genocide is killing solely on the basis, killing a group of people because of the group they belong to, solely because of their group identification. It's not an issue of justice. Whereas killing a large group of people in and of itself, if that people have perpetuated an injustice, is not itself unjust. The vast majority of Old Testament texts that speak of God judging cities or groups or situations where God judges a wicked and debauched society, where they're sacrificing children, they're brutally murdering, they're doing all sorts of things like this. So when the men of the East side with the orcs, we don't say, and we see the people of Gondor battling the orcs. We don't say, oh my gosh, they're committing genocide, right? We don't say that. So the key principle to keep in mind here is that God when he inflicts judgment, is doing so justly. Again, think of the men of the East in Lord of the Rings. When they side with the orcs, we're not horrified when the heroes take them on, when the heroes go ahead and fight the men of the East. These cities that God judges are images of cities given over to evil. But what about the firstborn? Well, the firstborn of Egypt in that scenario, remember that God is the author of life. So in the scenario of the firstborn, the death is painless, right? He just takes back life. With babies, as the author of life and the one who created all life, he has absolute rights over it. He has the right to take it back if he deems that we don't deserve to have the gift of a baby. He has the right to take that baby's spirit back to himself. Remember, in the case of David, when his son dies after he commits adultery, it's not a judgment on David's child. It's a judgment on David. But the child is taken back. Why? God says because he found something pleasing in the child. So he takes the child back, and so that the child is actually with him. Okay, and remember, there's a final resurrection at the end of this story. At the end of the biblical story, there's a resurrection in which all of those who are with the Lord, all of those who are resting with Jesus, will be raised from the dead. Okay, so what about... That's easier because there God does it himself. I think the hardest part of these stories, for me at least, are those times where God commands people to kill babies. And there are times when this happens in the Old Testament. So why does God do this? How could this ever possibly be good? I want you to imagine something that's pretty difficult, but imagine that a baby is dying from plague, coughing blood, right? A doctor might, in the medieval world, might have killed a baby to prevent further sickness, and that baby's fate was sealed. Now, we might say, well, he didn't have the right to do that. He still shouldn't have done that. Okay, and maybe that's true in the case of the doctor. But now imagine that God knows. He sees a baby, and he knows that this baby is so enmeshed and marred, damaged by the society of which this baby is a part, that it would be better for the baby just to be with him than to live. There are some traumas that can be done to children, to babies, that are lifelong. Now, almost all of the time, right, the vast majority of the time, we can't make that decision of, well, it would just be better than for the baby to die. We don't have that authority, and we can't make that judgment. We don't have enough information. But God, who knows that the Israelites are seeing something of the horror of what sin does to society, and in engaging in this visceral way, and enacting God's taking a baby back to himself in this way, they themselves see in a visceral way, and thereby are prevented from at least some of the kinds of sin, doing the kinds of things that lead a society to this point. Now, again, the only one who can make that call that this would actually, that a baby would be at this point, is God. He's the only one who can make that call. And so humans can't. Remember, murder is unjustified killing. And so it's never justified for us to kill a baby in our own resources or wisdom, because we could never know something like that. God's the only one who can make that call. Now, someone might say, okay, well, Sean, you said that part of the reason the Canaanites are judged is child sacrifice. What about Abraham and Isaac? Point beaten to death, right? So two things are important in the Abraham-Isaac story. First of all, Abraham is prevented from killing Isaac. But secondly, and this is pointed out by Thomas Aquinas, and I think this is quite helpful, it doesn't say that Abraham is offering Isaac in order to get God to do something for fertility or whatever. Aquinas points out that this is actually an enactment of judgment. So it's the same sort of thing, like going to Sodom and Gomorrah and fighting, killing Sodom and Gomorrah because of their injustice. Abraham is called to enact that on his own son. Now, we might say, well, that's cruel. No one should ever have to do that to their own son. Well, if my child was a serial killer, I might, right? And that would be hard and devastating, but you might at that point. And so what's important to understand what's going on there is, first of all, Abraham's not offering Isaac like a sacrifice like the way the pagan nations did. And secondly, even when he's about to do it, God stops him from doing it and provides the sacrifice himself. So those two things differentiate what's going on there from the way nations used to offer babies to their gods to, for example, get the sun to spin or something like that. It's just not the same. Not the same at all. Okay. Now, let's summarize these things really quick. When God judges the world, when he judges anyone like this in the Old Testament, he's confronting societies which are images of societies, which, because they are, societies so given over to sin. When God enacts the flood, he's doing so in a world, and the text tells us, in a world drenched with violence. It's not just that he's like flooding some suburb. It's that this world is that he's judging is so filled with violence and evil. And now some people say, well, God killed children. We're not told that in the text. Remember, this is a world that's okay with child sacrifice. So we're not told that in the text. Rather, what we are told is that the waters are the enactment of God's judgment against evil, wiping out corruption from his world. And God, as the holy, just God who confronts thoroughly evil societies, has a right to do this. Okay, well, what about when God includes within the laundry list of things he judges people for the worship of false deities? One of the core claims of Scripture is that you take on the characteristics of what you worship. It's wrong to worship a false god because in so doing, you're turning away from the source of all good. Instead of being oriented to the source of all good, you're oriented to like an elephant or to a bull or to whatever. You're oriented towards some sort of creature. And so instead of setting your heart on virtue and setting your heart on the good, you set your heart on a creature. And so become debauched and attached to the kind of creaturely ideal they represent. You start to reflect that into the world. And so the worship of false gods is wrong insofar as you start to reflect the value of the one you worship. And so you can imagine in Canaanite society, the values of that society were inscribed in their deities. So when God judges, it's not that he's judging like some suburb. It's more like he's confronting the men of the East who have sided with the orcs in order to clear a way for his redemption of heaven and earth through the family of Israel, culminating in the person of Jesus Christ. Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful to you. Let me know what you think in the comments. Go ahead and like and subscribe, and God bless.